Hi, everyone. This is the fourth session in our new series, the Philosophy Discussion Program. The series called Coping with Reality, 10 Philosophy Help. We will play a short video by John and Ronen Grunberg and then move on to the discussion. Tonight's topic is Critical Realism, Part 2. Ronen and John continue their discussion of how the idea of what is real has been affected by the so-called critique of knowledge, the skeptical approach to philosophy dating back to Hume and Kant in the 18th century. Ronen, can you play the video, please?
So I'm going to just open the floor for discussion, if that's okay with you, John and
Sure,
Alla.
Yeah. I think Alla's, gone to bed or something. Yes, she's on the other side of the Atlantic, right?
Yes, right.
But
Okay.
but she did a fine job in introducing it. Actually, Tori has the first.
Yeah, absolutely, Tori. If the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I think where you guys have been going around is the real distinction between realism and non-realism is between sort of the subject-object duality or the lack of the duality. Like Ronen, you were really sort of getting at that. Every philosopher thinks they're a realist. So there's all kinds of realists and there's all kinds of versions of realism. But I think the real distinction between realism and non-realism isn't so much, it's not realism versus idealism. It's realism versus non-realism, and it's really an ontological distinction. So Descartes and Plato were the non-realists, because they thought there were two different realms, two ontological realms. There was the physical realm, the empirical realm, and then there was the ideal realm or the mental realm. Both Descartes and Plato had these two distinct, absolutely separate realms, and that's unreal. That's an unreal position. So we call them, what's real is there's only one realm, that's the realism, and it's typically thought of in terms of mind versus matter, or it can be ideas versus empirical reality. But it sort of begs the question, you're still in the world, in the physical world, thinking about the reality. So idealism is just a kind of a higher order cognitive function of thinking about things, whereas existence and just preconceptual cognition of being alive on the planet or in the world is the basic the distinction between idealism and just existence is a cognitive distinction. You go into a conceptual mode, an intellectual mode of thinking about things. So anyway, I think that's the distinction. It's a subject object. It's this absolute duality that's the unreal position. The realism is we're in the world, and it's not like within our experience of the world we have this ideal, or we have this what is it? It's like the experience doesn't separate mind and world. The distinction between mind and world is drawn within the field of experience, not between experience and the noumena, the real things out there. Experience is our within our cognition of the world, we feel this internal mind of ours and that external world. It's unreal to think those are two separate ontological, separate realms. It's all one. We're all in one realm. So it's not idealism versus matter, or mind versus matter. It's being in the world and interacting with the world.
So Tori, that was good. Now, Ronen, are you going to be the moderator?
Sure, I can moderate.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I'll let you to respond to Tori. This is just to keep it thing, and I myself am going to put up my hand to be heard when my time comes. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I'm going to respond to Tori now.
Yeah.
Thank you, John, for putting me in that position. I do appreciate it. Okay, so Tori, I think that first of all, if you consider Plato and Descartes, they're both rationalists, they're both idealists, but they're very different. Right. But they both share one thing, which is that they argue that the mind is significant in terms of knowing things. And for Plato, you're right, there is a world of being that is transcendent, and that has all sorts of archetypes, really essences that represent what is here in the material world, which is like a pale right. reflection of what is in the ideal world.
Yeah, the empirical world is not real, according to Plato.
Right, the ideal world is a pale reflection of what is real. Right. Yeah, and the way that you can get to the real is just by using your mind, by using certain mental faculties, reasoning things out. By way of arguments, you can transcend and eventually reach that world of being. But to actually explore the world of becoming, the world of experience, is according to Plato, a futile thing to do, because you're just looking at imitation and pale reflections. Descartes said something very different. I mean, Descartes was also a person who argued for the primacy of the mind. We start with the mind, but he's basically arguing for a dualism. The mind is a substance that thinks, whereas matter is a substance that doesn't think but is extended in space.
Right.
Mind is not extended.
That's the
dualism, right? Because we've got right. So we've got two types of realities. So some of the I think that part of the problem with the conversation that John and I were having is that I don't think idealists would argue that it's impossible to know reality, like what is out there. I think that they would argue that it's possible to know what is real. I mean, certainly Descartes argued that. He argued that you need to have a method, and that you need to, understand that the I, the cogito, is involved in the knowing. But he didn't say, well, we can't ever know what is out there in the world. We can definitely know what is out there in the world, according to Descartes.
Yeah, that's true. But he still has this, it's an unreal, it's kind of like an unreal assumption, or an unreal metaphysical place that he's coming from. Because there's not two realms. I mean, there's just not two realms. So I think one of the things that he might say is that, well, he seems to separate the physical existence from, no, he thinks everything. No, I take that back.
I think
you can know reality, but where he's coming from, the metaphysical view is kind of like this God's eye view, which is kind of like, but it's idealism, an unrealistic idealism.
I think what Descartes is getting at is that there's one thing that's indubitable, that we know with absolute certainty. Like, I think, one of the way he does this in the meditations is that he asks, well, I'm skeptical about everything. Like, I'm going to take the role of an absolute skeptic. I'm going to be skeptical about everything that I can possibly be skeptical about. And he asks, is there one thing that I cannot be skeptical about, that no matter how much I try to be skeptical about it, I can't be skeptical about it because I know it's absolutely true. And what he gets at is that there's one thing that he knows with absolute certainty that you can't be skeptical about, and that's the fact that he exists and that he thinks. So the cogito, I think, therefore I am. That's where he gets that from. It's indubitable.
He concludes that he exists. His premise is that he thinks. The only thing he knows for sure is
thinking. Thinking comes prior to existence, because he even says that when he's skeptical, he says, I can be, I could be mistaken about my body. I could be mistaken about my body. But even if a malicious demon is out there deceiving me, there's one thing that he can't deceive me about, and that is that I'm thinking.
Yeah, but that's the fault in his method, because he doesn't just say, I can be certain about that I'm thinking, or that my thoughts are certain, or my thoughts are, that tell me that I exist. But he also applies that to all kinds of thoughts, like, maybe, it's a heliocentric universe, or that, the heart pumps blood, or whatever empirical things he wants to know. He thinks that just because he can think it, that it's true. But that's the error of Descartes' method. That's not the way to determine certain truth. Just because you have the thought, you have to go through and demonstrate stuff. Which, by the way, is, John, your philosophical order is very idealistic. By the way, you're not realistic. It's an idealistic, idea. And same with
I think that's disputable.
Realism per totem diem is total academic claptrap. That's what you're trying to demonstrate. That's I'm
going to defend my student. I don't think
that begs the question. What is real? What is real? It doesn't make it real just by you saying something dressed up in Latin.
I fully agree. I fully agree with that point. It basically,
you have to demonstrate that.
Dancy Mendoza coined that term in his thesis, and I just thought it was a good one, right? Anyway, but
the thing, I think, in modern times,
the accepted thing is metaphysical realism. I actually want to go back to your dualism, though, Tori, right? Which is this: you see, if we accept that there's a distinction between who you would call critical realists in the present day, Bhaskar, the late Roy Bhaskar, Tony Lawson at Cambridge, right? Yeah. They would be regarded as critical realists, right? And then John Searle, who you studied under, right, in California, he would be regarded as a metaphysical realist. They would be on the two.
Again, there's many variations, and every philosopher will eventually claim to be a realist, a metaphysical.
No, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. No, I will later talk about the different meaning of the term critical, which is something that Sherman took on this. The point I want to make is that both Searle explicitly rejects dualism, and to my knowledge, both Bhaskar and Lawson explicitly reject dualism. So that's not the dividing line between them. And you're familiar with the with the book by Dreyfus and Taylor, Retrieving Realism, which is in some ways similar to your embodied realism, well, they literally start with Wittgenstein. You know, a picture held as captive. That's the first line of that book, Retrieving Realism. A picture held as captive. So they're nailing dualism, right, like as it were, right on the first page.
Yeah.
And you know, Taylor's an interesting case because you regard Taylor as a realist, and he and Dreyfus, regarded, call themselves realists. I'm not sure that that book, Retrieving Realism, does that, right? And Taylor, for example, in Canada, is regarded as a member of the school of, quote, Canadian idealism. Which is
forget what people say. You gotta look at what each
philosophy. I fully agree with you.
Sort of sociology of knowledge, kind of.
Yeah, that's the point. That's the point that I want to make. And if we go back to Descartes, the criticism that Gilson made of Descartes was that he had no doubt that Descartes regarded himself as a realist. His point was that, Descartes was in intention a realist. But to the extent that he adopted the notions of idealism, strictly so-called, that is idealism in a philosophical sense, right, he's bound to fail. Because of the bridge, because you cannot go from thought to things, right? That's the point. So we're not going to call Descartes an idealist per se. He's certainly not. He would regard himself as a realist. As a matter of fact,
he's a dualist.
I would say. Sorry.
He's a dualist, and because there's two separate ontologies, one realm for physical stuff, one realm for mental stuff. That's where he's unreal.
Yes, but both groups,
despite what other people call, what he thinks or what other people think.
Yes, but everyone.
So I think we're kind of saying the same thing, but
I think we're all saying this. We're all saying the same thing.
I don't think.
But I think there's a big difference between the time after Kant till modern times. And there's Charles Taylor. I made a list of, it's the pragmatists and the existentialists, and now a lot of cognitive scientists like Piaget, for example. And so I've made a list like participatory, interactive, Lakoff and Johnson, contact, Dreyfus and Taylor, engaged agency, Taylor, embodied mind, Maturana, Varela, Roche, relational worldview, Ogilvy, being in the world, Heidegger, being to the world, Merleau-Ponty. There's a lot of non-dual realism in modern times that totally gets rid of the dualism of the Greeks, the dualism of the scientific age. We're in this new metaphysical understanding.
Yes, I agree. But
I'm going to give you guys another 2 minutes, and then
you're quite right. But we're not sort of joining the correct. We're not joining the correct issue. Again, the issue is not dualism. The issue is in the philosophy of mind, and the issue is what we mean by realism is that there exists a real world, outside there. Moreover, that we can grasp that world.
Yeah.
And the point I was trying to make was simply that everybody rejects dualism. That's not the issue. Is what I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to leave it.
But when you speak like we're speaking now, we are dualistic, but it's a relative dualistic. It's not an absolute separate dualism. It's a separate realms. So intellectually distancing and contemplating and being, higher order cognitive rational is is not being is a form of dualism. It's a relative dualism. It's not absolute.
Yeah. Again, what we
You've
yeah,
objectified.
we have to go on, Tori, but
Yeah.
you know, we'll
Yeah.
come back to this.
Right.
So let's have somebody else
Yes, exactly.
say something if you like. But Tori, you are welcome to come back and say something. Let's open the anybody.
Bill's got his hand up.
Oh yes, Bill, go ahead, please.
Thanks.
Oh,
Yep, thanks. Yeah, it took me a little bit to get off mute. Question, this is more of a question. Is it possible, how would we describe an environment, an environment that did not have an external objective reality? So, you know, or do we have to accept that there's an objective reality outside of ourselves that we are trying to model within our heads by science and philosophy? Or is it possible to conceive of an environment where there is no objective reality? Like sometimes I interpret Plato to mean there's an idealism, and that what we call reality is just a messy, you know, illusion of what the idealism is. In that case, we could say there's no objective reality. But I tend, you know, since I'm science-based, I tend to think there is an objective reality out there, no matter what it is. Even if we're living in the Matrix, you know, it's still an objective reality that's out there. So I'd love to hear ideas about the contrary component, the contrary idea there, which is that there is no objective reality.
Well, I just quickly say that's Humean skepticism in a nutshell.
But yes, but it could be that. But I think maybe what Bill is getting at too is like maybe the notion of virtual realities, like the Matrix. I mean, is it real in some way, or is it?
No, well, I'm not even getting that complicated or that deep. I'm just saying, like in the Matrix, the objective reality was we've been taken over by aliens and we're being farmed for food or whatever. That's the objective reality there.
Yeah,
and
the
our
machines.
the rest of it is just an illusion, but we are literally living in pods. So what I'm getting at is, I guess what I'm getting at ultimately is, does everybody agree that there is an objective reality out there, no matter how bizarre it is, like the Matrix or something, but that ultimately, if we had, you know, perfect abilities to investigate, we would uncover? Or is it, or are there options to say there is no objective reality? It's all just dreams. You know, it's dreams upon dreams upon dreams all the way down. It's just dreams. Right?
Okay. So does anybody want to take that and answer it, or shall I to answer?
I'll just say quickly, that's what metaphysical realism means. There's a reality outside of our minds, or outside of our cognitive internal consciousness of things that exist, that independently of our mind. That's what metaphysical realism means.
Yeah.
So then what would be the contrary to that then? So I would obviously describe myself that way, but what are contrary philosophies to that would?
Well, I don't think it's about are there things outside of ourselves, or are there no things outside of ourselves? I think that a philosopher like Plato, for example, argues that what is real is transcendent, that we're looking for archetypes in this world that is not in the world of material reality that we experience. He doesn't say that that world doesn't exist. He just says that if we want to get knowledge, we shouldn't start by looking at physical objects, because those physical objects, empirical reality, is just a a he wouldn't even say it's an illusion. He would just say it's not going to give us knowledge because it's an imitation of what is real. You know, what is real is the essence, and the goal of the mind is to understand the essence, what makes a thing what it is. That's what gives us knowledge. So by simply looking at objects like chairs, you know, many chairs, we're not going to understand the essence of chair, what it means to be a chair, its essential sort of character. That exists in another world, in the world of being, and so we have to use the intellect to transcend to that world of being. Okay, so that's a Plato primer, but Plato doesn't say that physical reality doesn't exist. He just argues that we're not going to get true knowledge by looking at physical things. We have to try to ascend to the being, the world of being, where the forms or the essences exist.
Yeah, the problem I have with that is, of course, that these are just labels. Like, so a chair is just a label that we apply to things that, I mean, for one person, it might be anything I can sit on as a chair. Another person might say, no, a chair has to have 4 legs, otherwise it's a stool. You know, so these are just labels. There's no truth there. There's just a model that I have in my head of what I think a chair is. And so my model in my head is approximating reality, right? Like, not so much approximating as in grouping or organizing reality in a way that, you know, works for my mental model, but somebody else's mental model may be different, and that
no doubt, Bill. I want you to understand that there has been a lot of I guess disagreement with Plato about the nature of essences and the existence of transcendent world of being, not least of which is his closest student, Aristotle. Aristotle disagreed with Plato about where the essence of things lie. You know, he certainly did not take Plato's notion of a transcendent world of being, and he had many arguments as to why that was not possible. And as far as I understand from my little reading of this, Plato did not like Aristotle. He was one of his most prized students, but you know, he certainly didn't appreciate where Aristotle was taking his ideas. But you're absolutely correct. I mean, that, you know, the notion of forms being more real than things has problems, without a doubt. But I just want to say that the bottom line is that Plato didn't argue that the physical world did not exist. If that's the question, that was the original question. He did not say that there's no physical reality. He simply said that we can't have knowledge, true knowledge, by simply looking at the physical world.
Yeah, and so is there then, does it all boil down to there's an objective reality out there and we are trying to uncover it, and in the process of doing that we develop mental models that we, you know, then test, and if they work they become, you know, scientific models or something like that, and then somebody else comes along and say, hey, I got a better mental model now, because we've included more data, or we've uncovered a few other things, like the you know, the epitome of that is like Newtonian mechanics getting taken over by Einsteinian mechanics just based on some fuzziness at the extremes, right? So, you know,
it's a
in
long
both
journey.
cases, it's assumed there's an objective reality that planets move in a particular motion that is objective, and we are just getting closer and closer to understanding what that objectiveness is, as opposed to,
I think, like, let me twist your question or your point, and then we'll move on to John Smithen. So we're talking about physical things right now. How about non-physical things like justice? Do they exist? You know, how do you sort of put justice or things like justice that that we think are real, but are not physical? How do you categorize them? How do you know them? How do you know what is real justice versus, not real justice? How do you determine that? You can't use a conventional scientific method to make that determination. You have to go somewhere else. But
although I would argue that you do, like meerkats, subject their members to social justice based on, they'll shun their members. I mean, and it's just the way they've developed. So justice is in a large sense a function of the beings that we are, like the way we've evolved and stuff like that. And our sense of justice is a huge part of that. We can talk about it, we can modify it, we can grow, but I would argue that too is part of objective reality, right? It's just, it exists, and we create models around it.
Okay.
Anyway, I mean, I don't want to belabor this point. I don't want to take up the whole thing with this.
You make some interesting points, Bill.
Yeah.
Like you really do.
I really was just curious about, are there philosophies out there that are more mystical, that completely reject the concept that there is a reality that if we knew everything, we would uncover, or if we spent enough time doing detective work, we would uncover, or whether it's just there is something that is just truly nothing but dreams, right?
Yeah. No, this is precisely the point. But Ronen, the computer's playing silly buggers with the hands. Rick had his hand up.
I'm sorry, Rick. And Henry just wants to come in, so I'll admit Henry.
Yeah.
Rick, can you please? I didn't see Rick's hand, so I don't know.
It was there.
Okay, Rick, can you please ask your question?
Rick, you have to unmute. Oh, he must have stepped out or something. Yeah, I do want to.
Edward has a question.
No, I had my hand up as well, Ronen.
Oh, okay. But
yeah. So I'm gonna.
I thought you just want to make. I thought you just
no,
wanted to.
No, I want to make a point. I want to bring it back to the point that Bill was raising, and strange to relate, Tori Bile said something correct a few minutes ago. I'm just waiting for your reaction, Tori. I'm winding you up a bit. I'm using a rhetorical trick. I said, strange to relate. You said something correct a moment or two ago. What you said correct was this: is you mentioned to Bill that yes, that was the definition of metaphysical realism. And actually, Ronen and I went through that a couple of sessions ago. The definition of metaphysical realism is that there are beings that exist and are what they are, regardless of our consciousness of them. Right? Okay. That's the ontological thesis. The epistemological thesis, which becomes very important when we start to think about Kant and all that sort of thing, that we can have knowledge of those beings. That's the ontological thesis. We can have knowledge of those theses. In answer to Bill's question,
that we can know something is the epistemological thesis, not ontological.
Yes, there's the epistemological thesis. There's an ontological thesis and an epistemological thesis, right? So Bill said, is there the opposite to that? That's metaphysical realism, right? Well, the opposite to that would be that there are no beings which exist independently of our consciousness of them. It's all a matrix, Bill, right? And then obviously the question of whether we can have knowledge of those non-existent beings or not, right, is redundant. You would have to, in an almost Kantian way, you would have to operate entirely within the matrix. The knowledge would be of these non-existent beings which only exist in your own consciousness, if you see what I mean. And to some extent,
right. That's not right.
No,
that isn't right. I agree with you, Tori. That's not right.
Yeah. For example, John,
No, explain
money,
why. Explain.
money does not exist. It's only in our minds that it exists.
No. Again,
Ontologically real, ontologically subjective.
I'm sorry, Tori. You said I said something not right. I did not say something not right. I have not discussed social issues. We didn't mention the nature of these beings. And what Ronen and I have talked about on several occasions, actually, is that those beings don't have to be material. Right. I'm trying to answer Bill's question was about, does there exist an objective reality outside of our minds? And you're quite right. We're not dealing with in those two things yet. We're not dealing with the difference between, quote, social reality and objective reality. But
no, there's no difference, though.
No, you are wrong on that point. Sorry, I'm sorry, but I do have to be a little bit blunt there. Let's just try to follow the logical argument, right? Okay. What is the logical argument? The definition of metaphysical realism, we're not dealing with the awkwardness between social reality and physical reality. We haven't addressed that issue yet. Brute facts versus, social facts. The answer, and I do have to repeat this as you challenge me. The metaphysical argument is that there are beings that exist independently of our consciousness of them. That's the point. We haven't specified the nature of those beings, but the ontological thesis, the epistemological thesis, is that we can have knowledge of the nature and existence of those beings, right? When we're doing the epistemological work, we would get into Searle's issue and the issues which you're raising now. But I'm just following on the logical argument from what Bill was saying. Obviously, the notions that if there are beings that exist independently of our consciousness of them, the only possible alternative is that there are no such beings, that nothing exists independently of our consciousness of them. And the only point that I was making is that, obviously the epistemological part becomes somewhat redundant. What you would do is you would enter into things like, phenomenology, things like, Kant's argument, and so on and so forth. Okay. That's what I'm asserting. Now, I don't want to, you can come back and you can pick that apart. What I was trying to do is to draw the contrast between
20 seconds, John, just because we got some people asking.
Yeah, okay, but I was interrupted, Ronen, by both you and Tori telling me I was wrong. But then we will go into the question I would like to ask to everybody is this: we know what someone who's a metaphysical realist would say. We know in answer to Bill's question what someone who is not a metaphysical realist say. What would be, and I would like Tori and Ronen to ask that, what would be the critical realist's answer to those two questions? The ontological question and the metaphysical question. But you can do that later if you like, because we've got Ted, we've got Henry Himmel, but that's the point I would like you to address.
Okay, so we'll go with Edward. Now, Rick, I know you had a question. So if you still want to ask the question, you can go after Edward, and then we'll go to Henry. So Edward, the floor is yours.
Hi. Oh, sorry. I'm a little bit further down the philosophical tree, perhaps, but I was just doing some research on critical reasoning and, of course, Descartes and all that stuff. And I guess the algorithm reminded me of some of the medical experiments that have been done where they split the brains they cut up the center of the corpus callosum, I believe it's called, in the brain to separate the two hemispheres. And the people that have experienced that experience reality differently as they have been through that experimentation with the left side of the brain holding the vocal centers and being able to communicate. And apparently the right side of the brain screaming in agony because it can't get its points across. And this, it seemed to imply that there's actually more than one creature potentially in my mind perceiving reality, and that depending on which one's in charge, it can alter my perceptions in such a way that I won't even know. So it's brought back into question going, I don't know whether I trust anything in the reality in that context. And I think that's what Descartes was really saying, right? Is that you can't trust any of your inputs, but you can only trust that there's somebody there who is receiving them. And I don't know whether that leads to a point or not. It goes back to that idea of what if reality is entirely subjective to my senses, then where do I go from there?
So just a quick response, and then I'll go to Rick or Henry. Descartes was a mathematician, and he argued that the world is essentially mathematical. So he said, you know, if you want to know the world as it is, the only way you're going to know it is if you can measure it, or you can only know the things you can measure. The mind substance you can't measure, and so it's not knowable in the same way that other things that are measurable are knowable. But Descartes didn't argue that you can't know reality. He just argued that you have to have a method for knowing reality, and that method involves measurement, and, you know, achieving a sort of indubitable sort of sense that something is the way it is, and the only way you're going to achieve that is by going through certain steps. But he simply, I think, created a dualistic sort of philosophical model where there's the mind that is a substance of a certain kind. The mind thinks, but isn't extended, so you can't measure it like using the methodologies of science that measure things. And then there's matter, which is extended, and therefore it's knowable using the methods of science. But he never said you can't know things. It's just that you have to apply a certain methodology in order to know things. That's where he was coming from.
Yeah, I think I get that. I was also think just going that because of these, like that split brain experiment I talk about, that I can look at one thing and this person could look at the same thing,
yes,
and not see the same thing objectively or perceptively or however. And it's like that's then you've got the individual experience of reality is maybe it's by chance or by luck that it aligns with most other people.
People
Otherwise,
people can have delusions, and Descartes was well aware of the fact that people can have delusions and that they can be misguided. For example, you put a stick in a cup of water, it looks like it's bent. Well, there's a method you can use that will make you realize that the stick is not bent, right? And that's kind of what Descartes was talking about. Like you have to apply a certain method to your knowledge gathering in order to be sure that what you think is knowledge is actually knowledge.
You need more than just your senses. You need the understanding to go along with it.
Yeah, and it's not just individuals. I mean, there's a method that you have to apply, and all, like if you're into science, all scientists have to apply that method in order to get to what is really real, as opposed to what you think is real. Yeah. Rick, did you want to say something?
Yes, actually, I was. Just got interrupted for a few minutes back there. I tend to agree with Descartes in that the reality does reside in your brain. I mean, there's been enough experiments done in the last few years on rats, especially when they run them through mazes, and then they stain the brain neurons. They can tell each rat, each neuron in a certain part of the brain, wherever they create maps of whatever their environment, and each little part is stored in a separate little neuron to create, so they know they take out that one particular neuron, that one part of the map that they know or their environment disappears from them. They are creating their own reality within their brains. And that's how they move around. That's how they, I don't know if you can, it's for them, it's an objective reality because it matches what's out there. Because if it didn't, they'd keep bumping into walls. And as far as I know, the human brain probably works similarly to a rat brain. So I think we all create our realities within our brains, and that's what we use to navigate. And it's a physical reality created in the brain. We use to explore the environment.
Well, physical reality is one. It's I would say it's a mental reality, and animals and people, they create their own versions of one reality. And those versions can be quite different. For example, you know that famous article by Thomas Nagel, what it's like to be a bat. So bats, they create their own reality, which we cannot imagine as humans, because we don't have experience. Like we know, for example, what it's like to be a dog, though we don't have that acute sense of smelling, but at least we know what it's like to smell. But we have no idea about what it's like to be a bat. So they create their own reality. But physical reality is one. That's what I think happening.
Okay, thank you, Nikolai. Henry, your turn.
Just listening to this, what I was thinking, we do operate with the assumptions. This is how I see it. Because if you look, for example, the religion perspective, there are atheists and agnostics, and of course believers. So atheists, they don't allow the concept of dog enter our brain. Believers, they believe that God exists. What kind of God? It's a different story, but they do believe in this. And agnostics, they are okay with the both versions. So what I want to say, according to Kant or Schopenhauer, there are things outside of our senses, the things that we cannot comprehend, but they exist. They exist outside of our phenomenal world. Why don't we admit that? Oh, and then the other thing is, the other option is, no, they don't exist. Everything that we can sense, we can comprehend, is what we can assume exists. However, why don't we accept the third option? Why can't we admit that we don't know? We don't even know if Kant is correct or not. We don't know because our brain is very vulnerable. Our mind is very vulnerable. And as someone mentioned here, we can be subjected to illusions or delusions, or depending on the environment, depending on the situation, depending on our lifestyle, depending on many, many, many things. So why can't we admit we are not able to comprehend? We're not able to comprehend the reality. We think it's reality. Well, of course, we don't have too many options. We live in the world based on our phenomenal world, now sensations, now feelings, and now thinking. This is one thing. Of course, we cannot go outside of this world. Does anything exist outside of it? We have no clue. We can assume, but we have no means to know. This is my point that I'd like to convey, that we just don't know.
Well, I'll open the floor for a response to that. If nobody wants to respond
can I come in on that without notice, Ronen?
Yes, you can, because I opened the floor. You can come in without notice, but I'll stop you if you go on too long.
No,
I just like go on, and
I just like to follow through.
Yeah,
I just like to follow through on what Henry said.
Yes.
and put it to the floor. My question is, Descartes' position that I think, therefore I think I am, and the only thing that is absolute is that he thinks he exists. I'm just wondering whether there has been a challenge even to that absolute, that he thinks he exists.
He based absolutely, because he defines our existence based on the thinking process.
Henry, your sound is terrible. I can't understand anything. Is
Really?
everybody else having that same problem?
Yes.
Well, I moved to a different location actually. I thought it's better here.
Now it's good.
Oh, okay. Let me relocate. It's probably my computer.
Maybe it's all in my mind. I don't know.
Very likely.
Yeah.
Is it better now?
Yes, it's good.
Okay.
You're
So
good.
what I'd like to say that Descartes is based our existence on our thinking process. However, there are situations for example, we can take meditations when the thinking stops. There are situations where just thinking process does not continue for a certain moment. Do we exist at that time? I think we do. But we don't think. So I don't think he is right. I think he is absolutely wrong, Descartes.
Well, okay. Only that you need to qualify that, because I would think you need to say, in my view, that you think we exist. But to say we exist categorically is an absolute statement, which many would question, because everything is coming through our minds. Everything, we can easily make the statement that from the atom to the ends of the world, to the ends of the universe, it's all within our mind.
With Descartes, I mean, let me respond quickly to Henry. I mean, Descartes says that when we are asleep, our cognition is diminished, but it doesn't cease to exist. You know, we still have some semblance of awareness. We're not completely gone. As we know, I mean, we dream, for example. So there is some sense of being there as a cogito, as a mind thing, but it's definitely diminished in terms of its capacity to be completely aware or completely conscious.
Conscious. Okay, if the person isn't conscious, the person exists in temporary unconscious, doesn't think anything.
Well, it still exists because we're not fully unconscious, or we're not fully gone. But when the mind ceases to exist, we cease to exist. Yeah. So the mind and the body are intimately intertwined. But you know, when the mind is no longer, then the person no longer exists. It's as simple as that. For Descartes, as far as I know. I mean, unless you can show me where he says otherwise. I don't. I think he definitely did say that, because you know, the mind and the body are separate, but they are intertwined. They're separate. They're two separate substances, but they can't live apart from one another.
Isn't Descartes' statement, I think therefore I am, I don't think it's drawing any conclusions about anything other than the fact that whatever I am, and I put the I in quotes, I am thinking, therefore I exist. So at that time, I know I exist. I may not be, you know, a Frenchman in the 1600s. I may be a computer algorithm running somewhere. I may be a little furry animals on some other planet that is hallucinating that I am a Frenchman in the 1600s or whatever. I can't remember when it's. But you know, same with all of us. You know, we can say I may not look anything like it. I may not have the house that I'm living in, that I think I'm living in. But the one thing I do know at this point in time is that I exist, because something has to exist to be thinking the thoughts that I'm thinking right now, even if they're all hallucinations.
That's right. I mean, I think you got the. I think
And
that's
it doesn't go. It doesn't go beyond that.
Well, no,
That's
he goes
all-
beyond. He does go beyond it, but he does say that the one thing that is indubitable is that I know that I'm thinking, and I can be deceived about all the things that I'm thinking, but one thing that I can't be deceived about is the fact that I'm thinking.
Well,
So,
Ronen, that was my question. If he were to be asked to prove that he's thinking, how would he do that? That might be a challenge.
okay, I'm not sure why it's a challenge. Because it's a form of intuition. It's an intuition. You know you're thinking. I know that I'm thinking right now. I mean, and thinking is not necessarily having a logical thought or an idea. It's just being conscious. I know when I'm conscious. I just know it.
Well, within the world that we exist in, we know that we are thinking, but beyond, there might be another world beyond us, which we have no knowledge of. It's a wild scenario, but I'm thinking that you say Descartes or yourself or anyone is there and think, okay, I know I exist because I'm thinking, but there might be something beyond us, another being, another world beyond us, where someone would just come along and say to us and prove to us that you're not existing at all.
Well, but we're going into a science fiction kind of scenario. I think that we have to kind of rein it back and say, well, what was Descartes' reason for putting this on the table? You know, the reason he was putting this on the table in the first place was because he wanted to know what is knowable. What can I be certain of? Is there one thing I can be certain of? You can question the sort of conclusion he comes to, that the one thing he can be certain of is that he thinks, but the reason he does that is because he wants to lay a foundation for knowledge. Okay, it's as simple as that, and we can take it in all sorts of directions that are like sci-fi type, directions. But for him, it's a much more fundamental thing about epistemology. What is knowable.
I'm sorry, just 2 cents. What Will is saying is real, because we cannot be absolutely sure that in this particular moment I am thinking. As I said, the mind is vulnerable, and the mind can be affected by different environmental conditions. Environmental, I mean the environment you're in particular moment. So there is no certainty, absolute certainty that everything real is based on my thinking process. Because people pretty often are confused. If you, for example, visit the mental...
But as I said, Descartes was aware of that. He said you can be deceived about all sorts of things. You can have hallucinations. You can be mistaken and have all sorts of things that you see in front of you that aren't real, because there's some cognitive impairment that's going on. But the one thing that you can't deny is that you are conscious of those things. It's as simple as that. You can definitely be mistaken about them, though.
Not necessarily. You might not be conscious of that. That's
okay. Well, you may not be aware that you're mistaken, but the point that I'm making is that whatever the case, whether you're mistaken or you're not mistaken, there may be things out there that you're not correct about, but you are conscious. You are seeing those things. You are aware of them mistakenly, but you are still seeing them. Anyway, let's just move on to John Smithen now. John?
Yes, I have 2 questions. I want to go back to the one that I asked a little while ago. I have one for Rick, who has his hand up anyway. Rick, your thing about the rats' brains, you said that the brains of the rats were changed, right? Okay. However, did the environment itself change? Not the rats' brains, the environment itself. Yeah, that's the question. If the environment itself didn't change, then all that's happened is that the rat's ability to cope with the environment has been changed. Like the environment itself is still what it was. That's the question that I ask.
Well,
yeah,
let
let me just ask the other one, Rick. You know, you'll come in after that, and then maybe the others will come back to you. I do want to go back to that fundamental, definition of what metaphysical realism was, that there are beings that exist independently of our consciousness, right, independently of our consciousness of them, the ontological thesis, doesn't rule out that there are other beings, that are non-material, right? Nor does it rule out that the other beings can have causal effects. Right. The second one was the epistemological thesis that we can have knowledge of those beings. We know what a metaphysical realist is. We know what Bill's would answer. We know what Bill's non-metaphysical realist said. What exactly would a critical realist say to those two things? The ontological thesis and the epistemological thesis. So I'll leave it to Rick next, and then hopefully Tori, Ronen, Bill, Sherman, who's been suspiciously quiet this evening. Could you answer that question for me, Rick?
Well, first of all, with the rats, if they do put them in a new environment, new neurons create that new map of that particular environment again. The old map is not thrown away then. It's stored as a memory. So if they ever do go back there, they have that particular map again. Mm. There's enough neurons in a rat's brain, they can store a huge amount of information. Yeah. I mean, look at our brains, I've got a really good memory, apparently. I can remember stuff back from, 60 years now. And it's as fresh as it ever was. At least I think it is anyway. Oh, and there's just one more thing I want to ask is, anyone here besides me ever had lucid dreams? Now, if you want to be in an altered state of consciousness, know you're conscious and know that what you're seeing is not real, have a lucid dream sometimes. It drives you nuts. Because you're awake, you're dreaming, and you're awake in your dream trying to do something.
Do you mean consuming substances or without substances?
You want to be steered off whatever the path is that my dream is set on. If I try to change things, it's like swimming through mud. But I know that it's not real because I know it or not. I don't always know it's a dream. Sometimes I have to do experiments to see if I'm dreaming or not. Do the laws of physics still apply or not?
Right. You must have seen Waking Life, Rick, have you?
What's that?
Have you seen the film Waking Life?
No, I haven't.
Okay, you must watch the film Waking Life because it's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, but I know people, I've read about other people having lucid dreams and they can control them. I can't. I've tried. Right. It's annoying. I'll get out to be stuck in one of them and know you're dreaming, and then all this stuff keeps happening. He says, how do I stop this? How do I wake myself up? But I know I'm conscious, and I know this is not real, this is fake real.
So you're saying the one thing you know for sure is that you're conscious.
Yes, I know I'm conscious. I'm thinking, right. Crap, what am I doing here?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Again, about losing consciousness under anesthetic, the sense of self is completely gone. There is nothing there.
Yeah.
The people still don't know why anesthetic works even. Because even stuff like they gave patients xenon gas, which is inert, totally inert. It knocks them out as an anesthetic, but they don't know why. As a noble gas, it cannot react with anything. It cannot do anything. It is inert, but it does something.
Yeah, I think Descartes would say when you're in that state, your body exists, but your
Your
mind is no longer there. So you're not conscious at all.
No.
You're as good as dead, essentially. Yeah. Sherman, did you want to?
Yeah, so listening to this, perhaps Lonergan would say that this whole discussion was much ado about nothing. And the reason why he would say that is because no one has really discussed the psychological basis to understanding. And for example, there's a book written by R.J. Snell, and it talks about Lonergan and Reuter on knowing without God's eye. The point of this book and the Lonergan point was that right from Plato to Descartes to contemporary philosophers, knowledge is derived by looking. So you can have a person like Locke who would say that we acquire knowledge of the world through our senses, and then we will have the mind's eye that would decide upon what is correct or not. Or you would have a person like Descartes who would have the intuitive mind, and or philosopher's inner eye. And in both cases, knowledge is derived by looking. And in fact, an article that Lonergan wrote in the 50s that was critical of Gilson discussed that point, that if you look at Gilson's book, even he says that knowledge is derived through the senses, through looking. So Lonergan would argue that you can never know reality just by looking. So that's perhaps one way of addressing Bill's point, that it will always be a confusing world if we understand the world, if we believe what is true just by looking. The other point is that, like I stated last week, there has to be a process. So knowledge is not just based on knowing, on looking, but it's a apprehension of the data experience. Then we have these images in our mind where we're thinking about the problem that we're pursuing. And then suddenly we had this eureka moment, we had this insight. And then we have this somewhat of a hypothesis. And then what we have to do is test the hypothesis. And then that hypothesis would then become a thesis, a concept. But then he would say that you have to go on and continue to test this hypothesis. And eventually you will make a judgment. Is this concept correct or not? Have I evaluated all the evidence? And that's the whole point of the detective's story. Have I accounted for all the evidence? And is there anything else left to be questioned? And then the next point is, am I doing the responsible thing? Should I let this girl go who was accused of a crime, or should someone else be convicted? I guess the easy way out, if you've watched the film, was allow the woman to be convicted. And a difficult way, and perhaps the more responsible way, would be to come to this conclusion. I am not fully certain that she committed the crime. I still have to look under a few more books or so on, and maybe I'll find that clue, which will in fact exonerate that woman, and at the same time convict this other person. That's when we acquire knowledge, according to Lonergan. So Snell's book is really a critique. Oh, one of the other points that Snell makes is, why is it that over the ages we can't agree with each other? Why is it that one philosophy replaces another? And in his book, he argues that it's all because if you look carefully, people understand the world through the physical eye or the mind's eye. So that's Lonergan's perspective. The other thing that I never talked about, and Lonergan's 800-page book does deal with, is what was also brought up over here: illusions and hallucinations. He would say that that's all part of the human process, a human being. And so what we need to have is not just insight into insight, but insight into oversight. And oversight could be bias. It could be a group bias, such as class. It could be we're part of a historical trend, and we're part of this wave of convoluted ideas, and then we have that particular group bias. And in fact, what he says is that if a society is in decay, if it's breaking apart, in fact, the last person who should stick his neck out is a philosopher, because he'll probably be the first one to be arrested and shot. So, anyways, he deals with those issues. And anyways, one final point is the idea of the philosophical order. So I looked at Lonergan's lectures. I went to the Lonergan archives, and I dug out his lectures when he was talking about philosophical order. And he, on the one hand, does not disagree with metaphysics. He doesn't disagree with the idea of a soul. They in themselves have their own justification. But his point was that if you're trying to understand how we think, if we're trying to gain an insight into insight, you can't do that by the soul. You can't do that by talking about potentialities, actualities, acts, and so on. And if you're going to deal with the metaphysical order, he would argue, as a mystic philosopher, well, you have to deal with the soul. If we're going to deal with the soul, we can never really get in touch with ourselves. As he stated, only in the end, maybe once we die, we would know what our essence is, or obviously, if you believe in God, then God knows who you are. But until we kick the bucket, until God tells us what's going on, we have to, in a literal sense, build our own resume. Over a period of historical time, we have a good sense of who we were and what we are. But again, that's not done through looking, it's through collecting all your documents in your life and then piecing them together and, in a sense, writing a history. Anyways, that's where Lonergan would come from.
Thank you, Sherman.
Ronen, I have to break in a little bit here. Thanks a lot, Sherman. That was good. We are getting close, to the end, right? So, does anyone? I'm just going to take, say, one more question from someone who hasn't spoken yet. No, okay. Then I would like, if you're willing, Ronen and Tori to both to answer that question I asked. Do you remember, Ronen?
Yeah. Well, if your question was about how would the critical realists respond to the metaphysical realist,
yeah,
the critique of a metaphysical realist, I think that a critical realist would say that both the metaphysical realists and the critical realists are doing the same thing. They are both trying to figure out what is knowable and how to get there. So they have a lot in common. The main distinction between critical realism and metaphysical realism is that with critical realism, as I understand it, the mind is actively involved in the process of making knowledge. It doesn't. It's not to argue that reality doesn't exist. It's just that the mind is actively and dynamically processing what it experiences, and that active participation by the mind is essential. So knowledge is not simply given, it's a process of interaction between the mind and the material reality that we are experiencing.
Yeah,
So
so-
I don't think it's a big problem, really.
yeah. Okay. No, I just wanted, and is it possible, Tori, to ask you to respond to that? You've got a lot of stuff coming up, so you've got plenty more time. But how would a critical realist respond to those two crucial theses? The ontological thesis and the epistemological thesis.
Well, repeat the epistemological thesis. That's where I think
the one
but
is
just say what you said.
Yeah, the first one, the ontological, that there are beings which exist independent of our consciousness of them. That's it. The second is that we can have knowledge of the existence and nature of those beings. I imagine that's the sticking point. Am I right?
But I would say that doesn't even identify. Well, that's metaphysical realism, and like Ronen was saying, I don't think critical realists differ from those statements.
Okay. Yeah.
And I would say Plato and Aristotle also. The Greeks are the ones originally who introduced metaphysical realism. There is a reality. There's an ontology out there, and we can have an epistemology of it.
Yeah.
That's
Okay. Yeah.
But it's all.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry,
John, may I contribute a couple of things?
Yes.
There's contradiction in my view, because when you say, okay, let's assume from the ontological point of view that these beings exist, but we have no means to know them, then how do we know they exist? If we cannot define them and we cannot comprehend them, how do we know they exist?
Well,
we can assume.
Yes, I mean, obviously, the metaphysical realist answers that. He says, yes, we can have knowledge of them. The question I was asking, and I don't know if you have an answer, is how would a so-called critical realist answer those two theses?
I think John. Sorry, Henry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. It's puzzling because when we admit that something exists beyond our ability to comprehend it, we cannot claim that it exists.
No, we're not saying it's not about the ability to comprehend it. It's not what we're saying is it's not created in our mind. That's the ontological thesis is that we have the ability to comprehend it. The first one is that there are things which exist independently of us. Simple as that. The second is that we can comprehend them.
Critical realists don't argue, like Kant, for example, that things exist only in the mind, or that the mind is making things up. Immanuel Kant says that things exist out there in the world.
Yes.
He's not questioning the fact that there's
they accept. Cut short, and obviously we have to go. So they accept the first thesis. So the difficulty then is with the second thesis.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. The big question is how do we know these things?
Exactly. And for the epistemological issue. I think.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think what okay. Here's an answer for you, John.
Yeah.
The epistemological thesis, Kant says. Kant, if you want to call him a transcendental realist,
he
could say we can't know the thing in itself. Yeah. We can only have a perspective on it.
Yeah.
We can only know it the way our minds know it. We can't know if God exists, but we can think that there could be a God, and then that would shape our behavior accordingly, our moral behavior. Think like that. We can't know things truly in themselves, but we can have some conception of them.
I think what's interesting about Kant, interesting about Kant, John, is that he puts, he does put a limit on how we can use the categories of understanding. He says we have to be careful not to use the way that the mind works in ways that will lead us astray. So,
Yeah.
for example, you can't use the idea of causality to try to prove the existence of God, like Aquinas tries to do, because the category of understanding cause is only applicable to things in experience. You can't apply causality to transcendent sort of things of faith.
Yeah.
It's not appropriate. And so he puts a limit on how knowledge can be gathered. But he doesn't say that knowledge is impossible, nor does he say that things don't exist in the world out there.
It's great. Actually, I've got to where I wanted to get to. Sherman has the very last word goes to Sherman.
So there is a world that we may not know, but who's to say that one day we will know it? There may be certain laws of physics that are beyond our comprehension at this point, but maybe in 50 years or 100 years, our descendants will get the point. They will have the insight, they will have the theory. And so, again, I don't want to talk as if he is a dogmatic philosopher. He's not. Lonergan. His point is you have to think for yourself. But he would say that humans are driven by a sense of wonder, a desire to learn and know more. And so under different circumstances, historical circumstances, maybe later we will get the point and we will understand this matter, something that was a puzzle to us 100 years earlier.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks, Sherman. That's really good. Now, I'm going to turn off the recording in a minute, but we can sort of stay and chat later if we like. So thanks very much, everyone. It was an interesting session to me, and I learned a lot from it, and particularly in that, last little exchange. So thank you very much. Now the API as a whole is going to take a break over the holiday season. However, it's not a break forever, because the next session in this program, in the PPS program, will feature, guess who? It will feature Tori Biles, Ronen Grunberg, and myself talking about plain old realism, realism itself, as opposed to the critical version. And, that will be on a Tuesday. We're moving away from the Thursdays. I think Tuesday is a better day for most people. That will be on Tuesday, January 16th, 2024, also at 7 p.m. Then Tori will be back again on Tuesday, January the 23rd, 2024 at 7 p.m. Toronto time. And Tori's talk is going to be, philosophy or psychology. Back to that issue, right? Philosophy or psychology, embodied realism, and the economy of being.